Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians. The Russians continued advances within the Sumy regions, both in the western parts to regain control over Kindrativka, pushing the Ukrainians out to the outskirts of the town, while also advancing within Yunakivka and the western parts of the town. In the eastern section, the Russians continued offensive operations west of Tortesk in the direction of Novosibirsk, and continued offensive operations in the direction of Yunakivka, south of Kostiantynivka, and in the direction of Rusin Yar. The Russians also continued advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance both to the west of Yunakivka and in the direction of Kindrativka, gain control over the northeastern parts of the town, leaving the Ukrainian positions remaining in the northwestern parts of the town almost completely kicked to the outskirts. They only have a presence within this part of the northwestern street. With this, the Russians almost have full control over the town, and the Ukrainian positions are almost completely out of it. Regain control of Kindrativka with the reinforcements that have arrived in the area will allow the Russians to restart offensive operations beyond it. It is unlikely they will start storming the next line of defense from Putin in the west to Marina in the east before they gain full control over Yunakivka, but they may be looking to regain control over Andrivka here to the southeast of the town. With regards to Yunakivka, the Russians have managed to gain control over their first line here to the southwest of the town, allowing for them to kick out the Ukrainians from the southern outskirts in the southwestern direction with the river line that splits the town into two. The Russians are looking to gain control over the last remaining parts of the town that remains on the northern bank of the river line. With control over that, the fighting will redirect to the southern parts, where they'll be looking to isolate the remaining positions from their withdrawal direction and focus their forces on the eastern parts of the town, gaining control over the entirety of Yunakivka. Will create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the direction of Marina and Setki. Will also allow the Russians to build up Yunakivka as their own logistical hub for their offensive operations, going in the direction of Grabeshinya, Marina, Sunovosich, and these towns on the eastern flank of the next defensive line. They can also switch completely to defensive operations, so they look to gain control over the remaining two towns in Rivka and Vereshine, where they'll be looking to establish a defensive line and then spread out their offensive operations by attacking towns such as Satki and expanding in the eastern and western directions in the direction of Yesrubne, Stepne, Velika Rybitsa, Saparicia, and Miropilya. The objective would be to widen the buffer zone across the border area between the Kursk and Sumy regions by gaining control over additional towns and settlements along the border area. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians made numerous advances in the direction of Kostiantynivka. On the western flank of Tetsk, the Russians continue closing the pocket of the Ukrainian forces by storming Novosibirsk, gaining control over the remaining parts, the final street here to the north of the town. And they also started storming Shcherbenivka, gaining control over the fortified positions just outside the southern district of Donetsk. With this, the Russians now have 100% full control over the city. And they are also storming Shcherbenivka from the south and from the east. The Russians are here storming the defensive lines along the first lines to the east of the town. With control of the northern flank, they'll be looking to re-enter it from the north as well. And they are storming it directly from the south through the railway and the residential area in that direction. With the Russian operations from all directions towards Shcherbenivka, it is likely that the Russians will use the northern flank as a choke point, to which they will be cutting off the supplies of the Ukrainian forces while storming Shcherbenivka from every direction to gain full control of it. Beyond gaining control over Shcherbenivka, the Russians will be moving on to the northern flank, where they'll have this additional part of the residential area. It's unlikely they'll start storming it directly head on. Instead, they'll likely be focusing on the northern flank here near Katerinivka and Klibenbik before they close that part of the pocket. It could also be that the Ukrainians have started to withdraw from the northern residential area, to which the Russians would start storming them instantly to try to catch the final remaining Ukrainian soldiers within the residential area, and with little resistance they'll improve their ability to gain control over the more fortified positions on the high ground here in Katerinivka and Klibenbik. In either case, it is likely that Russians will gain full control over the southern flank of the reservoir, within the next few days to few weeks as they continue storming the defensive positions of the Ukrainians within the operationally encircled area here west of the city. And with full control over the city, the Russians will develop offensive operations on the northern flank further towards the city of Kościanivka itself. To the west, the Russians continue their offensive operations within Yablonivka, where they managed to gain control over the street that connects Yablonivka to Oleksandro Kalinova in the eastern parts. According to the Deep State map, the entire area here south of Yablonivka has become a gray zone as the Ukrainian forces are not able to properly hold a defensive line in the area with the Russian forces on both flanks of these positions, which means that the Russians will likely soon gain control over the entire area here in the gray zone and storm into Yablonivka from the south, combined with their forces from the western flank. And with the recent capture of the roads here in the north, gaining control over the street in the northern parts of Yablonivka, the Russians will start storming the final 3 fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of Yablonivka, opening up the road for the Russian forces to start fighting in the direction of Stepanivka on the western flank of Kościanivka. At the same time, the Russians will now be fighting over the eastern parts of Yablonivka just across the river line from Oleksandro Kalinova, which will open up the Russian forces to start storming the remaining fortified positions here along the reservoir, the western flank of it. It is unlikely they will advance beyond that of Yablonivka, as the Ukrainians are located within the city of Kościanivka, and with the numerous fortified positions on the outskirts of the city, the Russians do not have an interest in storming all of these fortified positions head-on to gain a foothold within the town, as it will cause a lot of casualties for the Russian forces. Instead, they will be moving through residential areas where they have cover, such as the Dacha area, the railway area, and the town of Ivanopilia, here in the southeastern flank of Kościanivka. Other than that, the Russians will be operationally encircling them before they start any operation towards storming the city itself. In the direction of Rusinya, the Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of the town, allying the front line here to the southeast, gaining control over the forest line and the road that leads up to the eastern flank of the town, as they continue positional fighting to gain control over the fortified positions and the town itself. In the direction of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians made 2 advances. In the direction of Zeleny Heights, they managed to gain control of the road between Novorodsk and the town, gaining additional control over the southern streets of the town as they continue storming it from the eastern direction. Combined with the recent advances along the fortified positions to the south of it, the Russians are getting very close to gaining full control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians were geolocated to be present both in the direction of Yalta as well as Voskresenka. However, considering the recent update by Deep State Map showing Russian push towards Voskresenka from the rear, it is likely that this footage is old and was just recently uploaded, which means that these are operations that took place prior to the Russian capture of the settlements. Obviously, both Yalta and Voskresenka now have a small buffer zone between them and the Ukrainian forces. Especially Yalta, the Ukrainians would have to do a river crossings to gain re-access to the town. While in the direction of Voskresenka, the Russians gain control of the fortified positions, the northern and southern flanks of the town, and the geolocation was in the northern parts of it. This means that the recent Russian advance would negate such a Ukrainian advance. If it was recent, then the Russians would have already recaptured the settlements. The Russians are now developing offensive operations beyond that of Voskresenka in the direction of Oleksandrorad, combined with their efforts on the fortified positions to the north and the storming of Zeleny Heights, which are the last 3 settlements here along the border area between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. Excluding the southwestern parts here connected to the Saparicia region, including those, there are 4 remaining settlements under Ukrainian control on the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, but there are still numerous fortified positions that the Russians will have to fight over on the northern flank of Zelenopole, western flanks of Vilnopole and Shevchenko, towards the outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, these are located to the south of the defensive line of the Ukrainians. Instead, the Russians will be focusing on the northern flank to look to gain control of these areas, pass into the Dnipropetrovsk region, either on the southern flank of the Vovcha River line or both the southern and northern flanks, which will be flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from the rear and their weak points, with the Vovcha River line as the northern flank, fencing them from that direction, and the fortified positions being pointed in the southern direction, the Russians will be able to gain control over Alexandrorad and then bypass the defensive and fortified positions from the rear, supplying themselves with a strong northern flank as the Vovcha River line, and with control over the eastern flank, they'll be fighting over the southern flank, which will be the next step of the Russian offensive operations, gaining control over Novopavlivka here in the western flank of Pokrovsk before advancing further in the northern direction towards Meshova and Slovianka, and advancing here to the western flank of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region to gain control over the defensive line leading up towards Pokrovsk here in the northwestern direction to gain control over that as the logistical hub on the rear of the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the Saparicia region, to which the Russians can develop offensive operations here west of Velika Novosilka once they capture the defensive lines of the Ukrainians and expand their zone of control in the direction of Volyaipole as well, developing offensive operations along the eastern flank of these defensive lines, gain control over them bit by flanking them from the rear and the sides, gain control over the areas that are well connected by highways, will significantly improve the Russian logistical capabilities in the eastern flank of Saparicia, with the positions connected near Pokrovsk with the highway to the south and to the east. The Russians will be able to concentrate a large force here in the eastern flank of Saparicia for offensive operations going in the northern and western directions towards the city of Saparicia and the city of Dnipro in the north. It is unlikely that the Russians will develop the offensive operations towards Dnipro before gaining control over Pokrovsk, which will create additional logistical hubs for the Russian forces, along with larger concentrations of forces. However, the city of Saparicia, to start fighting over that, the Russians need to gain control of Pokrovsk, Novomykolaivka, Vilnyansk, and then they'll be able to start storming Saparicia from the northeast. It means that the Russians will completely bypass the defensive lines of the Ukrainians to the south. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.